Welcome to the Access to Innovators podcast, powered by the premier life skills university, High Point University.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Thomas Hart. I am a senior sports media major at High Point University from Fort Mill, South Carolina. Today, I'm going one-on-one with Byron Pitts, Emmy award-winning journalist, author, co-anchor of ABC Nightline, and most importantly, High Point University's journalist in residence. Byron, thank you so much for taking the time today to chat with us.
My pleasure, and I wish the listeners could see how sharp you look. I love the tie bar, brother.
Thank you. So, born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, correct?
Yes, sir.
And from the beginning of those days in Baltimore, what drew you into journalism in this path you're in?
Probably, I would think by the time I was maybe middle school, high school, I think in general, I was raised, in a Christian household, and so I was raised to believe that God has a purpose for all of us. And so I'd always thought, like, what's my purpose? Like a lot of kids, I played sports, so I thought, man, I'm going to be a professional athlete. And then I got to high school, and I worked for my high school newspaper. And I remember the first time I wrote an article, and it was about our football coach, who was a man I really admired. And I remember walking to the cafeteria and seeing my classmates, like, reading the article. Some were, laughing at parts that were funny. Others were just, you could tell they were engrossed in the article. And it was the first time in my life I'd been recognized for something other than sports. I was recognized, I thought in that moment, for my writing ability. And that felt good. I didn't learn to read until I was 12. I spoke with a stutter until I was a junior in college. And but certainly by the time I was in high school and I was beginning to learn to read or become a better reader, I loved to read. I loved to write. And because of my stutter, I didn't talk a lot, but I wrote a lot and I read a lot. And so I thought at some point, wow, like maybe this is what God wants me to do with my life, these are skills I really, really love and maybe even have some talent for. And so that kind of sparked the idea. I went to college. Not all that different from High Point, called Ohio Wesleyan University, small Methodist school, and majored in journalism. And by that time, I was convinced this would be my life's work, being a journalist.
So you started off writing. When was that first time you stepped in front of the camera? And obviously, for I think most that have been in that situation, you feel like all the pressure in the world's on you.
Oh,
what was that first moment like?
Oh, it was awful, right? Awful for me, awful for people who had to watch, awful for the poor cameraman who was traumatized at this, skinny kid with big glasses and a really big afro. I wasn't very good. I sucked, actually. But I was nervous, full of insecurities, preoccupied with how I sounded, how I looked. And it's interesting. One of the things I think about, if not getting better, more proficient in this business, I'm more and more mindful it's not about me. And so it allows me to think less about myself and more about whoever I'm talking to or whatever it is that I'm doing. But yeah, I was awful. Yeah. Nothing about that first on-camera look suggests that I would be where I am now.
So most people, I think, when they are working with a camera, working with a teleprompter, they almost make it seem like they're talking to someone else on the other side of that camera. And obviously, you think about maybe the thousands, millions of people watching on the other side. Who do you think of when you're looking into that camera, and what do you think of entirely?
It's a great question. And final thoughts to your earlier question was, like, a lot of people think, like, any given profession is about ability, right? And that, there's talent that's seen early on that foretells what's going to happen.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
Tiger Woods could hit a golf ball when he was 3. Okay. But a lot of us get to where we get just purely, has less to do with talent and more to just how hard we work. Tiger is someone who has incredible talent and a unmatched work ethic. But to answer your question, for me, for a lot of my career, the conversation was either my mother, who my mom's passed away, her name was Byron Pitts from Apex, North Carolina. A lot of my career was like just talking to her. Or if she wasn't available in my mind, it'd be my grandmother, or maybe my girlfriend, or my roommate, or a friend. Because I recognized earlier that while I might be talking to, any number of people, up to, several million people at a time, people are listening to it, watching it one person at a time. And so I found, for me, the most effective way is to have that singular conversation, but have with a million people. But you're having it only once. And that allows a couple of times, a couple of things. It allows me to choose my language. Like there's one kind of language you might use if you're really talking to a million people at once. There's another language you may use, another tone you might use if you're talking just to one person. Mm-hmm. And there's a tone you might use if you're talking to someone who's not an adversary, who's not a stranger, who's not a viewer, who's not a demographic, but you're talking to another human being. And I think there are universal truths. If you're talking to a human being, you may take into consideration that they're black, white, male, female, young, old, Republican, Democrat, American-born, foreign-born, right? All those are, because you have to be respectful of your audience. But I think at the end of the day, it's like, I'm one human being talking to another human being.
Mm-hmm. So you say your mother's from Apex.
Yes. Actually, she's from Friendship.
Okay.
Which is a small community inside Apex.
So from Apex, North Carolina, Friendship.
There
North
you go.
Carolina.
Thank you. That's right. Whether races are friends is how the town got its name.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So you start out at WTVD in Durham.
As an intern, yes, sir.
Correct. What did you learn from that time as an intern? I know so many students here are starting to kind of move towards internships in newsrooms, in some of these networks even. Kind of what did you learn from that time in Durham that you still apply today?
That I suck. I'm not that smart. There are a lot of really smart people in this business. Really talented people in this business. A lot of people far more talented than I am. I was intimidated, but I also learned wow, that if you work really hard, because I'm seeing some people around me who are working really hard, then you can be successful. And for all that I lack, I know that I can work hard. So maybe there's a place for me. It reinforced for me that I really wanted to work in television. One of the reasons why I chose TV over newspaper at the time was, I grew up playing, as I mentioned, playing sports. I played football in college. So I'm like a team kind of guy. I like being part of team efforts. And as you know, broadcast media is much more of a team sport sometimes that's changing, than print. Mm-hmm. Right? You can go off as a print reporter and almost never talk to never talk to anyone in person, right? Necessarily. Whereas a broadcast journalist, at the very least, there are going to be other people who are needed to help get you on the air. And so I love that collegial team aspect of that. And I saw that working at WTVD. I love that. I love the, I've always been kind of an old soul. And I was less drawn to the glitz and glamour, if there is any, of television, and more drawn to the power of television, to tell important stories, to influence how power is used, what politicians do, informing people, comforting people in some instances. So I was really drawn to that. So for me, my internship only reaffirmed how much I sucked, how hard I had to work, but it was something I wanted to do with my life.
I would say I'm, as someone that's very interested in sports, that's the career field I'm going into. I think you bring up a very interesting point that I've never really thought about, that broadcast really is a team sport. And you don't realize it, I think, until you really take a point and look at it.
Oh, yeah.
But even in the situation we're sitting in right now, there's someone helping with the audio, and then that will be sent to someone else to be then distributed to the next side.
Right.
And I think that's a very key point to look at that I don't think we realize.
Sure. And that everybody, and for the team to win, everybody has to excel at some point, right? For the team to win. There are all kinds of teams, right? But if you look at just in sports, the most successful team, we all got to be friends. We don't have to be booed up. We don't have to hang out together, but we have to respect each other. We have to have a common goal. We have to support each other. One of the many things I love about Tom Brady, Super Bowl rings, how gracious he is, but I love his EQ as a leader on a team sport. Like when a rookie shows up, whether it's in New England or in Tampa Bay, Tom Brady walks over and introduces himself. Say, "Hey, I'm Tom Brady." Dude, anyone who plays football knows who you are, right? And you're going over to a 22-year-old rookie and you're introducing humbly himself to him. I love the fact that like he was in no shade at the quarterbacks who take the $50 million contracts. But Tom Brady was always willing to sacrifice his own individual income so that other people are paid, so we're successful. And one can make the argument long term, even financially, Tom Brady will probably do better than most quarterbacks who made more money with him during their career because he won so many championships. And that's what I had this guy, Bob Dotson, legendary NBC correspondent, said once that a good TV news piece is like a wonderful jazz ensemble. And in a jazz ensemble, everybody gets a solo at some point in the course of the set. And I think I've always tried to be mindful of that in my career. Like it's my responsibility as the band leader, as the quarterback of projects that I work on, or at least that's the position I want to play. I might be the nose tackle, but in my mind, I'm the quarterback. Is to make sure that the sound person, at one point, they get to shine. That we're going to let like the Nat sound play. The photographer, he or she, they're going to have their moment where they get to shine. I, as someone who perhaps, get to do the bulk of the writing, at some point, not me, but I'll let the writing shine. And even sometimes I've made the choice in my professional career where like I'll encourage the sound to shine or the picture to shine, even though I think there's a better way to go about it, or I'd rather take that time. It's like, no, you need to you always need to distribute the ball, right? So for me, it very much is a team sport. And what I like about it being a team sport is one, it's collegial. It's you get to celebrate other people. The pressure isn't always necessarily on one person. And I like I'm far, because of my own insecurities, self-doubts, limitations, I can be very hard on myself and, talk myself out of things, be my own worst enemy. I am better at, I think, sometimes cheering and supporting other people. So I think it helps me to do better work if I feel like, even though the camera's on me, in my mind, the camera isn't on me in the course of the project, that if you shine, as opposed to, I don't want to do a bad job, I don't want to let you down. Like, I don't want the photographer who worked hard all day busting his or her butt, and then I mess it all up at the end. Or I don't want the sound person who's like, I don't want the producer. I don't want to let them down. So, yeah, I love it, the fact it's a team sport.
Speaking again from the time in Durham, what is one thing that every aspiring journalist needs to do? And I have a feeling I'm going to know your answer, but I want to hear it first.
Journalistic, I always tell people, when you go to tell a story, tell me something I'm only going to know because you were there. Your take on something, right? Because otherwise, let's just send robots, right? What's going to distinguish you, right? Because you want to have a following. You want people to say, oh, my man's on. Here's what I know I'm going to get from that. And so I think the same, so one of the things I attempt to do when I tell stories now, no matter where it is, I attempt to see something, pick a pebble off the ground that I see, and I'll bring some attention to that. I'll give you an example. So I was a witness to the execution of Timothy James McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. Mm-hmm. I was one of 10 media witnesses to it. So after his execution, they got lots of media attention at the time. There's a press conference where all these professional journalists, professional observers were all asked to make opening observations about what it is we saw, what happened. And so I remember walking out to the press thinking, what was I going to say? And I, took my own advice. I'm going to tell you a detail that you may only know because I'm going to tell you that. And so the only thing I say, Timothy James McVeigh died with his eyes open. Of all things that went on in the room, one of the things I noticed is that when he took his last breath and his skin went pale, his eyes were still open. It wasn't the most significant detail, but it was a detail that I saw, and I made the choice. Because I was there, people will know. Because I'm figuring, people will know a lot of the, he died at 7:21.
The generic responses.
Right. So that's one thing, yeah.
My guess was going to be that everyone needs to read more.
Absolutely. Some of the best advice I ever got is one of my heroes, the late Ed Bradley, who was a 60 Minutes correspondent, one of the all-time great interviewers in our business. And I asked Ed for advice. And I don't think it was original to him, but he said, what's the key to being a great interviewer? And he said, read, listen, listen. So anyone I've ever, as best I can, I take as much time as I have in preparation to know as much about them as I can, for a couple of reasons. One, because just, when you're talking to someone, like I always want to be respectful, right? Whether you're a serial killer or you're a leader of the free world. Like there's a baseline of human respect I want to give to you. And to me, one of the ways in which I demonstrate my measure of respect for you is I'm going to spend time doing my homework about you, so I know basic things about you. And at some point in the course of our conversation, I'm going to sprinkle in, so oh, Byron did his homework, right? Just, and so that's always important to me to let people know that I am respectful of them. I also think, just as a journalist, we're researchers, right? We're a poor man's historian. And so that's a part of what is, I think, we are required to do, is to read and to do your own. So yeah, read, listen. It's like a lot of times when I go into interviews, I find the older I get, my sheet of questions gets shorter. In part because I'm old and I have a shorter attention span, I don't see that well. But also I've learned over the years, as I've acquired more knowledge, that my basic knowledge by any particular subject, or at least the areas in which I concentrate, I know a lot about those things. And so when I go to the interview, I'll read in addition whatever else I need to do, but I'm more focused on listening. So as opposed to going to an interview now with 10 questions, I'll go into most interviews I do now, whether the interview is for a minute or the interview is for 5 hours. I'll walk in with no more than 4 questions on the piece of paper. There are 4 particular, pillars that we need to deal with. But once I ask the question on the piece of paper, then after that it's all follow-up to the follow-up. You know what I mean? Because I've done my homework, I have a working knowledge. Anything, oftentimes for me, if I have time, if I'm interviewing someone, if they've written books, I'll give you an example. So a while back, I interviewed Mike Tyson for this documentary that ABC did about his life. Fascinating guy. And so by the time I sat across from Mike Tyson, I'd read the 2 books, one authorized about him. I had looked at pretty much every national interview he'd ever done. I read probably, this isn't bragging, this is just the process. I read probably 80 articles in the course of his career. I watched a handful of documentaries that were out in the public domain about him. I even went back and watched a couple of his fights. So that I didn't spend as much. I spent the least amount of time watching his fights as I did the other things. And so that when I sat down next to him, here's my first question. I would say, Mike, you were. This maybe wasn't my first question. It was one of the earlier questions. I said, Mike, you were molested by the time you were 12. You've been arrested 37 times by the time you were 13. You're the youngest heavyweight champion in the world by the time you were 20. That's a whole lot of life. That's all I said. It was less a question, more so of a statement. And that's kind of sat there. And whatever he said, and then that led to my follow-up question. And so in my mind, what I wanted him to know in that question was, I've done my homework. I know who you are as much as any stranger could know. I've done my homework. Our conversation isn't just about your marriage, isn't just about the rape conviction, isn't just about the your boxing career. It's about your life. And I'm someone who spent some measure of time looking at your life from the time you were, right? Mm-hmm. And I could see in his eyes, because Mike Tyson's a very, very bright man. I could see in his eyes, he sort of in that moment recognized, oh, okay, this isn't just another random interview. Maybe at the very least, this guy has he's shown me a measure of respect by doing his homework. The other thing I did with Mike Tyson, which I don't do all that often, but I brought Mike 5 books. Because in my reading, I'd read that Mike is not only is he a boxing historian, he loves to read, right? Intense reader. And so in doing my homework, I knew his interest about a variety. So I brought him 5 books. One was called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. Another one was called The Great Game. It's like a 600-page book about Afghanistan. Another book was Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett Jr., a book about slavery, and 2 other books. And to my surprise, he'd read 4 of the 5 already.
Wow.
But again, in that moment, while he'd read 4 of the 5, I think he appreciated the fact that, like, oh, wow, this guy has done his homework. He knows I like to read. He didn't see me just as like a dumb jock or whoever people think Mike Tyson is. And so, and then I find out Mike Tyson, a very intentional guy, he'd done some homework about me. So he knew that I'd been a war correspondent and that I'd spent time in Afghanistan. Because one of the books he had read was The Great Game, which isn't like, easy bedtime reading. And we ended up spending the first, 20 minutes of the 3 hours we had with him talking about Afghanistan. And so by the time we kind of got around to, that's another reason why I was able to ask the first question. By the time we got to the interview, it was like, this was a man who I want to believe felt like he was sitting across someone who respected him, respected his journey, someone who had his own sort of interests, sort of knowledge of the world. And now, as opposed to being a reporter interviewing a celebrity or whatever, these are 2 men who are about to have hopefully an interesting conversation about one of their lives.
And so once again, that's tying back to what you said about you're giving details, you're bringing those details to the table that not everyone else is going to have.
Right.
And that's exactly what that preparation does.
Yeah.
So you mentioned an interesting point there. You said whether it's a 1 minute or 5 minute or 5 hour long interview.
Mm-hmm.
What's the longest interview you've done? Because, of course, a 1 minute interview could have all the bits and pieces
Absolutely
you need, and the 5 hour interview could have nothing.
Nothing. Trash, for sure. I tell you, so I interviewed Nelson Mandela in Boston on his first trip to the United States after being freed from prison. Former head of the ANC and eventual president of South Africa. So I only had a chance to answer one question. I said, Mr. Mandela, of all the things that you know and believe, what is the one thing for which you have no doubt? He says, brother, good question. He said, the one thing for which I have no doubt is that good and evil are constantly at war, and good men must choose. Like it was gold, right? And I've lived off that interview for 30 years, right? Yeah. The longest interview, I'm trying to think. I've probably, okay, let me think. It's the big things I've. So the Mike Tyson interview was 3 hours. We did a story about this guy who was exonerated for killing Malcolm X. That went a couple of hours. That went several hours. I would say in the 3 to 5 hour range. Mm-hmm. Here's a funny. For me, it tells you how who you're talking to here. I'd gotten to 60 Minutes, my dream job. So prior to going to 60 Minutes, most interviews I'd ever done in my professional life to that point were a minute to maybe 45 minutes, maybe an hour if you include, changing tapes and stopping to eat a sandwich, right? I get to 60 Minutes, you do hour-long interviews. And the first big interview I did, we went on for a couple hours. I fell asleep during the interview. Not eyes closed, head bobbing, but mentally I'm who are you? Yeah. What are we talking about? Yeah. Why am I? Because when I asked him a question and he answered it, and it was dead silence. So I remember is he having a stroke? What's wrong with Byron? I'd fallen asleep. I'd never talked to anyone, any stranger that long ever in my life. But eventually I got better at it. I didn't fall asleep as quickly or as often thereafter, but I still had moments for yeah.
So, as you know, HBU, God, Family, Country University, your book, Stepping Out on Nothing, talks about faith and family mm-hmm. and how it helped you kind of mm-hmm. conquer a lot of these challenges you had mm-hmm. growing up. What about those challenges, and how did you deal with them? leading into, I mean, what advice do you have for others that might be battling the same challenges?
So my particular challenges was, growing up in a working class family, which, there are just some economic challenges that come from that kind of upbringing. Raised by a single parent, my mom was awesome, had the best parent in the world, but I had my mom. My father was an active part of my life. My stutter, which was challenging, right? People would hear me stutter and think I was stupid. The fact that I didn't learn to read until I was 12. I wasn't a very good student, so people, again, thought I was stupid. Bullied some as a child. What I want to say with this about my faith and being respectful of where I am and who may be listening to our conversation. I'm an unapologetic Christian. I believe Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior. I believe He died for my sins. And I believe that if I live a right life, I will go to heaven. And I believe I'll see my mother again. I believe all those things with all my heart. I believe in miracles. I believe in grace. I believe in the power of prayer. Like, I was raised to believe there was nothing that hard work and prayer couldn't overcome. I believe that to my core. But also, I'm a journalist, right? And I show up at my stories. I mean, I'm many things. I'm a Christian. I'm a black man. I'm left-handed. I'm a single-digit handicap golfer. Like, I'm a terrible card player. Like, I'm many things. And I'm mindful that when I show up at places, I don't hide the fact that I'm black. I wouldn't even disguise the fact that I'm a person of faith. I remember the first time I went to Afghanistan, I was working at CBS, and people who know me know that I travel with my Bible, and like the running joke in my office is, if Byron's door is closed, either he's asleep or he's praying, right? Instead of the running joke about me, probably sleeping more often than praying. But I remember
hopefully not during interviews.
Exactly right. I was first time I went to Afghanistan. Dan Rather, who was my boss and a mentor and a friend, said, cautioned me about bringing my Bible with me to Afghanistan. Besides being a Muslim, there were extremists in there who were killing people who were not of their ideology. And like right now, I wear my mother's cross that she wore her entire life, and had it on when she took her last breath. And I'll wear it as a reminder of my faith and of her. Anyway, so I decided a side story. Okay, this is old man just kind of wandering off, right? So forgive me. So I'm in Afghanistan, and I have my Bible, and I today at this stage of life, like every morning I pray, I meditate, I read over a particular group of prayers. This thing called Our Daily Bread, which I read every day to kind of ground me in my faith. So I'm in Afghanistan. And this is like November of 2001. And we're, out in northern Afghanistan, and we're staying in huts, sleeping under the stars, all kinds of weird places. And so I had to be creative to find places to do my devotional. Like sometimes I'd be in my bivy sack, in my sleeping bag with a headlamp covered up doing it. But this one particular place, we're staying in this really lovely 5-star mud hut place we were staying, structure. And I had like a little corner room I could kind of go in. So I was doing my devotional. And there's a window, no glass, but a window. And I sensed someone looking at me. Come to find out the next day that a couple of guys who were working for us, local Afghan men, saw me. And so one of them said, "So Mr. Byron, we saw you reading last night." Okay. And we could tell by your demeanor, by your reverence, that it was a holy book. Okay. Was it the Quran? Now, in order to make it home to my family, I'm not above lying right in that moment. So I thought about it for a second. I thought, but if we start having a conversation about the Quran, I'll be exposed because I've read it, but I don't really know it. And I said, put my hands across my chest, dropped my head. I said, "Gentlemen, I'm so very sorry. I meant no disrespect, but I'm Christian, and I was reading my Bible." And again, because by this time we've been together for a couple of days, there's a level of mutual respect, right? And these certainly weren't people. These men were not extremists. I knew I wouldn't be threatened by them per se, but just in that, So we had a conversation about faith and about Christianity versus the Muslim religion, kind of go back and forth. So at the end of our conversation, I kind of can see, you know what? Maybe you guys are right. Maybe this whole Jesus thing, maybe I got it wrong. I mean, it was a home game for them, so I want to be, I want to be a little deferential because I want to make it home to my family. So a couple of days later, we're out working, and we come across, and I'm listening to a headset of music. This is a Walkman, back before you were born.
Not AirPods?
No, not AirPods, right? Little wire hanging from a big old square box, right about the size of a lunch pail. And I'm listening to this music, and my daughters, who sang in a choir back in our church, have put out some music. So I'm listening to them, and I got my eyes closed, and I'm kind of like humming to my Christian music, just having a great time. And what I don't realize is, very briefly, we go through a space, and someone fires at our vehicle, like with AK-47, several rounds. Fortunately, they weren't accurate. Nothing hit our vehicle, but there were shots around us. So I'm like, I'm jamming to the music, and I feel like the pressure of the bodies over my eyes, and people like ducking and bending over, and I'm like, I know the road's a little bumpy here, but what's going on? Because I don't hear what's going on. So finally we get, again, this doesn't last more than 10 seconds, and we get beyond. They were going to stop to make sure everyone's okay. Then it was hit. And they're like, I'm sitting between these two guys who I was talking to the other day about religion. And they said, Mr. Byron, you are crazy. Like, they were just shooting at us, and you seem so calm. You weren't even paying attention. You were like dancing, whatever it was you were doing. I said, see, brother, that's what Jesus will do for you. And they were like, okay, all right, okay. So it was a nice moment. Where was I going with any of that story? Oh, anyway, but also I want to make the point about, I'm also respectful of all faiths. Mm-hmm. I've been in parts of the world where I've met men and women who've risked their lives to save mine, who showed me incredible kindness and grace and generosity. And they were Muslim. They were Hindu. And so, I've lived long enough and I've traveled enough to be respectful of all faiths and to know that there's a commonality in all faiths. There's truth. There's earnestness in all faiths. That if I were born and raised in Afghanistan, more than likely I'd be Muslim. If I was born and raised in India, more than likely I might be Hindu. And and so goes the world. But because my mother's from Apex, North Carolina, and she was Baptist, because my grandmama was from Apex, North Carolina, and is Baptist, therefore I'm Baptist. But the great Yogi Berra, and so while respectful of all faiths, the great Yogi Berra, the late Yankee catcher, had a great saying, says, always dance with the one that brung you, right, in life. And so it's my faith that I learned at my mother's knee that has brought me. So I am unapologetically a Christian man, but I'm respectful of other religions. And let me say, and I'm saying it to sound pious, because as a pastor friend of mine would say, we all have skeletons in our closet, and some still have meat on the bone. And I'm certainly in that category. So my faith informs a lot of decisions that I make. And it's what's kind of sustained me, right? I was raised to believe that God is good. I was raised to believe in the power of prayer, and I was also raised to believe, even though I was raised by a woman who grew up during the worst of Jim Crow in North Carolina, and endured all kinds of awful experiences as a woman of color in this country. I was still raised to believe that America is the greatest country on earth. And I believe that, not in an arrogant way, because there are wonderful places around the world. And there's wonder in every part of the world. But what I've discovered in the course of my career and my life is that one of the so wonderful things about America, I believe, is the promise of America. Not a guarantee. And America isn't always fair, because no part of life is. But the opportunities that exist in this country, that despite challenges that different groups face in our country, in America, it's still possible. If you work hard enough, if you dream big enough, you can do anything you want to in this country. And so I've always understood that from how my mother raised me. So that certainly informs my journalism, that informs how I live my life. And last thing I'll say, but I'm clear about, like, when I show up at a story, I certainly show up as a black man, Christian, left-handed, raised by a single parent, blah, 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 blah. I prefer the AFC to the NFC. All those things are true about me.
You didn't add in the single-digit handicap golfer, but
That's
I'll
true.
let you keep
Well,
going.
I'm afraid some of my friends back home might be listening. And when I show up and say, what are you? I'm a 12. I'm going to live with that, right, until, we get to the clubhouse. Like, I don't know, man. Like a 78. I don't know where. I was playing out of my shoes. Okay. So just in case. But so like I had another experience earlier in my career. I was working in North Carolina. My first job in Greenville, North Carolina, and they sent me. So I was like 22 years old, and they sent me, young hungry reporter, to I believe it was called a Ku Klux Klan jamboree. It was like a weekend retreat for Klan members somewhere in eastern North Carolina. And they had agreed to allow a local reporters to go cover it. And one of my bosses thought it would be great for some reason to send me. Maybe because, as they say, this person didn't see colors, didn't perhaps realize I was a black man, a young black man. He sends me to cover this Klan rally. And so it's a weekend thing. And they had agreed to allow journalists to stay there for the entire week, like sort of in bed, to see the process. So I remember waking up like on a Saturday morning, beautiful Saturday morning in North Carolina, right? Nothing beats it, Mm-hmm. Sky's perfect, weather's great. You can smell the pine in the air. Great morning. And I woke up to the sound of Amazing Grace, right? Great, interesting enough, written by a former slave ship captain. But anyway, one of the, great song, top 10 songs of the Christian faith. And and it's one of my mother's favorite songs. And I wake up and there's like a youth choir singing this song, and they're just, it gives you chills. And so I open the curtain to the opening to my tent, and I look out, and it's a choir of young white kids, all in Klan outfits. So I thought, okay, certainly as a Christian man, I'm attracted to Amazing Grace. As a black man, I'm a little uncomfortable being in an event hosted by the Ku Klux Klan. But I realized in that moment, I'm not there necessarily as a Christian or as a black man. I'm there as a journalist. I'm there to tell their truth, to cover the facts. Now, my life experience may inform my knowledge of what's going on or how I may see it initially, but it's not my responsibility. Like it's not. So it was a really wonderful moment for me as a young reporter, that it's not my job. Like I will make judgments when I get to a stories, but it's not my job to judge people. It's not my job to take sides. It's my job to go in search of the truth in any given space. I've been. Another last thing I'll say. I remember, when President Trump was campaigning, going to a bunch of Trump rallies, and sometimes there was this, let's say, animosity between the crowds and members of the press. And I remember there'd be like people would say unkind things. Well, I'm from East Baltimore, so I've heard a lot of unkind things in my life. So people yelling at me was like, okay, fine, whatever. So, and I remember I would often, not in a menacing way, but I remember I would always go and I would stand at the edge of the press area and like politely look at people in the eye, if they were close enough, who were chanting these ugly things, just kind of smile. Not in a like, I'm better than you are, but like, dude, like, what? Really? And I remember one time getting stopped by these guys who were like, you're a heathen, you're part of the, the evil, liberal, devil worshiping press. You don't even know the Lord or something. I said, well, actually, since you brought it up, I'm actually a deacon in my church. What's your favorite scripture? Here's mine. And I remember thinking, oh. And we ended up like taking a selfie together, and we were like boys. I'm sure the next Trump rally they went to, they were still like, hang the press, but in that moment. Yeah, so I embrace kind of who I am, right? Yeah. I know who I am, whose I am.
So you talked about covering the OKC bombing. You've talked about covering war in the Middle East. You've talked about even a Klan, rally, a meeting that you went to in Eastern North Carolina.
They had a great barbecue, by the way, at the Klan rally. I just want to say. Okay.
What is the toughest story you've covered?
Great question. So, like tough, it kind of varies. Like what? Okay, so the stories in which this sort of moved me the most. I remember when I was early in my career, I covered a story about 5 friends from Franklin, Virginia, who were killed in a car accident. They were like guys like about your age, like 19, 20 something years old. They were going to a basketball tournament and went together, head-on collision. All of them were killed. And I remember going to, talking my way as a young reporter into one of their relatives, where all the family was gathered, to talk to them. And so they talked our way into their house, and they was like, okay, you can talk to us, but no one wants to talk on camera. I'm like, I don't know if y'all know this, but I'm a TV reporter, right? Okay, so what we finally were able to convince them to do, we set up a microphone in the kitchen table, no camera, and relatives could walk into the kitchen if they wanted to, and I wouldn't even ask a question other than tell me about it, and they would just kind of say what they thought. It ended up being one of the most, for me as an early reporter, it reminded me like this is going to be my life's work, and a great television story isn't just about pictures. Mm-hmm. It's about many things that can potentially. Okay, but probably a story that moved me a lot was the Oklahoma City bombing. Mm-hmm. At the time, I was a young parent. I had young kids, and I flew in like the rest of the media world to cover it. And when I get there,
the story behind all of that, dating back to Waco, Texas, is incredible to kind of look at it from a different perspective.
Sure.
But
absolutely, absolutely. And so to get there and realize that children have been killed, that was a tough story. I was in New York on 9/11. Mm-hmm. I saw people fall from the building. Mm-hmm. I saw some people go from the building, fall them all the way to the ground, and saw them hit the ground. Saw them, hurt them, hit the ground. That was because like most stories I've ever covered, with the exception of Oklahoma City and 9/11 probably, but even more 9/11 than Oklahoma City, most stories I've ever covered, and I've covered my share of death in my career, mostly in war zones, usually, like it wasn't a surprise that people died or that bad things happened, right? Because often, whether it's street violence or war or whatever. One of the things that always bothered me about 9/11 was that was one of those cases where those people were only guilty of going to work that day. Mm-hmm. They hadn't, and so the unfairness, the cruelty of that was really, so those stories stick with me. Yeah. Though, like all the stories I've ever covered in my 41 years in the business, probably the only story I think about at some point in the day, every day, is 9/11.
And to think about it, for my generation, I was a year old. Mm-hmm. I don't remember it, and we're starting to get to that age where either kids weren't, or people even going into the workforce did not see it or were not even alive for it. So it's interesting to hear my parents, my dad working in uptown Charlotte, they were evacuating everyone out of there. My mom being a school teacher. I mean, it's definitely interesting to hear people's stories about it.
And to me, it reminds me like when I was a kid listening to people talk about World War II. Like, wow, this seems so long ago. But yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your extraordinary advice and achievements with us today. We're so grateful for your commitment to mentoring HBU students and joining a remarkable, innovative program that inspires our students and our campus community. Thank you for joining me on Access to Innovators podcast, powered by High Point University.